Bonjour. Bonjour everyone. My name is Elisabeth Martin. My pronouns are she, elle, and her. Welcome to today's segment on creating healthy work routines. I am the co-chair of the BC chapter of the Federal Black Employee Caucus and a member of the core team of the Anti-Racism Ambassador Network, also known as EREN. It is a grassroots movement made of public servants willing to amplify the work of Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals in the field of anti-racism. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am joining you is from the traditional unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples, especially the Musqueam, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, Twasan, Katsi, Kwakwetlem, Kwekwe, and numerous Tolo nations. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. Au fur et à mesure que nous progressons dans la session d'aujourd'hui, veuillez partager vos questions en utilisant le bouton questions et réponses dans la langue de votre choix. Vous pouvez voter pour les questions que vous voulez poser en cliquant sur le bouton thumbs up. Today we have two panelists joining us. I would like to welcome Jessica Ward-King. Hello, Jessica, Senior Analyst at Canadian Heritage, and Jean-François Claude, Senior Advisor at the Center of Expertise on Mental Health in the Workplace with the Treasury Board Secretary. Let's meet them. But before we get started, we thought that we would poll you. How many of you take your allowed breaks? Aujourd'hui, Jean-François et Jessica vont partager leur expérience, leurs réflexions sur la mise en place de routines de travail saines et les ressources auxquelles vous pouvez accéder après la séquence. There is no doubt that in the past 19 months, the pandemic has taken a toll on our mental health. Back in March, we saw the survey on COVID-19 and mental health release statistics that 1 in 5 Canadians screen positive for symptoms of depression. 1 in 5 Canadians screen positive for symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and that these symptoms can undermine well-being and the quality of life. The sharing of lived experience can elicit strong emotional responses from audience members who may have gone through or are currently struggling with similar issues. If you need mental health support, please visit your organization's intranet site for contact information on your Employee Assistance Program, also known as EAP, or look up your EAP provider in the online directory. So now I would like to start with the questions. And I have to say also, before we start, that I have to work hard and be disciplined myself to take my breaks. So before we start, I would like to ask you this question to you, Jessica. What impact has working virtually had on your work routines and therefore mental health?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, I know for me that when COVID-19 pandemic lockdown started, I had just been at my new position for 3 days. And so having, not created some of those linkages with fellow team members, not having had those coffee breaks, those lunchtime chit chats, I miss those. I'm a very social person, and so working at home with the nascent Zoom revolution just starting, not quite sure how to connect with people, really impacted my mental health, and I actually started a relapse of my bipolar depression that's lasted right until this day. It's very stubborn. And I know that with work routines, I would be one of those people that takes the bus downtown and walks a few blocks, gets off a couple of blocks early, walks a few blocks to work, takes the stairs up instead of the elevators, and take my lunch breaks to have a walk around the city. And without any of that, and with nowhere else to go, malls were closed, outdoor spaces were limited, I found myself not exercising enough. And I truly was not taking the breaks. It's much more difficult. I mean, even while there's a kitchen right beside me, I find it much more difficult to prize myself away from the computer, having to always be on, not having spaces between meetings to walk from one meeting to another, and instead just having to click a button and be from one meeting to another meeting to another meeting. All of these things, these parts of working from home, have really affected me. Also, I mentioned that kitchen next to me, having that kitchen there. I have to work really hard to keep it stocked with fast and healthy options rather than fast and potentially more harmful options. So working from home was a game changer, and not in the best sense. And it's taken me these 19 months to really work out some kind of way of working that is healthy for me. And even so, I still struggle. There are days when I admit I don't take my breaks, and even struggle to take my lunch as a break. So it has really impacted me for sure. And I know that from speaking to others, it impacts others too in similar ways, and also in slightly different ways for others.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I can truly empathize with you, definitely, particularly when you talk about being active and all of a sudden slowing down. And what about you, Jean-François Claude?
Merci beaucoup, Elisabeth. Similarly to Jessica, in the sense that, I think one of my main forms of exercise is essentially walking. And so certainly you have that taken away from you by not having that regular routine. But that being said, I mean, overall, I'm fortunate in that I have seen an uptick in my mental health these past 18 plus months. And so maybe to give you a little bit of context of the two main mental health conditions that I deal with is generalized anxiety disorder and persistent depressive disorder. And like Jessica, I relied on public transit to get to the job downtown. But that was actually pre-pandemic, adding to my anxiety and stress. Because for those of you who aren't in the Ottawa area, I'm sure you have heard about our wonderful light rail transit and how well that's going. And so not having that 2+ hours a day of commute time has been beneficial to my mental health. Now, in some ways, it does encourage me to maybe work a little longer than I would have, because I'm not sort of set to a particular transit schedule or whatnot. But generally speaking, it's also given me more time in order to spend a bit of time outdoors and go for a walk. And certainly earlier in the pandemic, concerted effort was made to take those kinds of breaks. But in preparing for today's session, I realized that I'd let that slip, so I'll have to get back to that. Mais c'est certain que l'importance là d'avoir des routines. Écoutez, nous sommes des créatures de nos habitudes, hein? Donc, avoir notre routine chambardée comme cela a été le cas avec la COVID-19, il est très important d'établir une nouvelle routine. Et ça va varier d'une personne à l'autre. So, I mean, I can speak to my experience and recognizing that, I may be one of the exceptions where mental health, has sort of benefited from working from home. I do have to recognize that I'm coming from a position of privilege here where, I live on a 3-acre property. outside the city limits. I'm surrounded by nature, so I have a lot of those opportunities. I'm also fortunate enough that there's space in my home where I was able to have a dedicated workspace so that at the end of my workday, right, I could log off and shut the door. And that's sort of me commuting, right, to get out of the office. Donc, en général, c'est ça. C'est certain qu'il y a eu quelques points au courant de la pandémie où ça a été plus difficile. Où sur l'aspect social, ça me manque quand même si je suis une personne plus introvertie que mon amie Jessica, ça me manque quand même d'avoir ces conversations-là avec des collègues. Donc, une chose que nous avons établie avec notre équipe, c'est une petite demi-heure le vendredi après-midi, un petit social sur MS Teams. Et donc, je fais tout dans mon possible là, pour m'assurer d'être libre pour participer à ça. So, I mean, that's one way that our team has addressed it, is having like a 30-minute social break on Friday afternoons, just for connecting and try to have a bit of those, you know, side chats or those water cooler conversations. Merci.
Je vous en prie. Quelle très bonne initiative de mettre en place justement ces réunions hebdomadaires afin de garder le contact.
Oui.
J'ai une autre question pour vous, Jean-François. La littérature indique que les employés sont surchargés de travail et que certains ont du mal à s'éloigner de leur ordinateur, particulièrement s'ils vivent dans un espace confiné, par exemple. Et donc, nous souhaiterions savoir comment maintenir ces routines de travail saines.
Il n'y a pas vraiment de solution magique. Hein? En bout de ligne, c'est une question d'avoir des conversations honnêtes et ouvertes avec votre gestionnaire, avec les membres de votre équipe, afin vraiment d'établir, si on veut, nos limites. Donc, ça peut être, par exemple, essayer de trouver d'autres solutions autres que d'avoir des réunions là, dos à dos, via MS Teams, mais c'est certain que c'est pas nécessairement facile. Hein? Je pense que la chose la plus difficile à apprendre lorsqu'il s'agit de gestion de la charge de travail, c'est apprendre à dire non. Comment est-ce qu'on dit non à notre patron? Donc, c'est vraiment une question de négociation dans un certain sens. Hein? Donc, si on nous demande de faire un projet additionnel, je pense qu'il est important d'avoir ou d'établir cette relation-là avec votre gestionnaire pour dire, écoute, je suis bien prêt à accepter de prendre cette nouvelle tâche, mais j'ai ces 10 autres tâches-là qui vont devoir être mises de côté ou quoi que ce soit. Donc, c'est vraiment une question d'apprendre à prioriser, à connaître ses limites, puis à les communiquer à nos collègues. So again, no silver bullet. It's about being self-aware enough to know what our limits are and what our boundaries are, being confident enough to communicate those boundaries to our boss, to our colleagues, and then trying to abide by those. Because if you know, for example, if one of those limits is I don't check my email after hours, and yet you start responding to emails after hours, if you're not respecting your own limits, it's kind of hard to expect others will respect those limits as well.
That's a very good point. And I took note of what you said. Learn to say no to your boss when needed.
Yeah, I would say it's, I should probably say it's no, but present an alternative.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jessica, what are the signs that we are reaching our mental health crisis or suffering, particularly for people who don't necessarily have this self-awareness and keep pushing themselves to their limits? What are the tips that you can give us? Oh, you are on mute. You are still on mute. That is the pandemic. No meeting without a mute button. What we can do while you are fixing it, I can maybe ask Jean-François to jump in and ask and answer this question, and then we will go back to Jessica.
Sure thing. What was the question again?
Yes, so the question was, what are the signs that we are reaching our mental health crisis or suffering? Quels sont les signes que nous sommes en train d'atteindre notre point de rupture et que nous nous épuisons?
Ben écoutez, ça va varier d'une personne à l'autre. Alors, ça commence d'abord par bien se connaître et savoir ce qui est normal versus ce qui l'est moins. Bon, dans mon cas, il y a certains signes là, précurseurs là, que les choses vont dans la mauvaise direction. Ça peut être des enjeux avec le sommeil, soit de l'insomnie, par exemple. Ça peut être aussi de l'irritabilité. Ça peut être également des changements en termes d'appétit. Donc, lorsqu'on parle souvent en contexte de santé mentale, on ne pense pas toujours aux aspects physiques, mais il y a certainement une composante physique à tout enjeu lié à la santé mentale. Donc, ce sont les genres de signes que je reconnais. Ça peut être également des choses comme, des fois c'est plus subtil, hein? Et c'est peut-être quelque chose qu'on va observer chez un collègue plutôt. Mais si on a des collègues, par exemple, qui participent activement à des réunions, puis qu'on s'aperçoit que depuis quelques réunions, ils interviennent moins, par exemple, c'est peut-être signe qu'il y a un petit quelque chose là, qui se passe. Et c'est bon à ce moment-là de faire un petit check-in. So the signs, will vary from one individual to the next. In my case, increased irritability, sleep issues, loss of appetite can be signs of things that are going on, difficulty concentrating. And those are some of the same signs that we should be on the lookout for with our colleagues. And yeah, maybe it's a little less obvious since we're not seeing each other in person, but there can be telltale signs virtually. So for example, if a colleague is usually quite active during, MS Teams meetings, and you notice over the past few meetings, they're a little more quiet, maybe jump in a little less, that might be a sign that something's going on and maybe an indicator that it would be good to do a check-in with them.
Thank you very much. Jessica?
I'm back.
Welcome back.
Oh boy, yes, fun pandemic times, working from home. Technology is stressful. Yeah, I mean, Jean-François made some excellent points there, some of which I was just kind of cheering silently. I think that it's really important when we're trying to assess where we're at to realize that there is a bit of work-life dynamism that happens, that we're not always going to achieve balance, that there are going to be some periods at work that are more stressful and maybe a little bit more, overcharged. And then there are going to be periods where there's a little bit of a lull. And I think what is important to notice is when that's not happening, when that cycle, I mean, we're never going to get full balance where you spend exactly the right amount of time at work and exactly the right amount of time on personal life. But when you notice that it's not balancing itself out, being more dynamic, when you're not getting those periods where there is a little bit of rest, where there is a little bit of downtime, and you start to notice that your mood is slipping, for example, that you're not enjoying the things that you used to enjoy, that you're finding yourself, Sunday night comes and you're getting stressed out about going to work the next morning, and what's all going to be there. Those are telltale signs that we are heading straight into an unhealthy way of relating to our work. And Jean-François also made the point of, noticing when your colleagues are also not doing so well. And it's so important that we're there to be contact for one another, to be able to to advise one another on, how we're feeling and what we can do to make it better.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I remember then when COVID hit, because as you may notice at my accent, I have a strong French accent because I was born and I was raised in France. It was very difficult for me to be here in Canada on the West Coast while my parents were in France. And at that time, Europe was shutting down the borders and people were overwhelmed. And it was very difficult for me to spend sleepless nights watching the news with my parents, to have this bonding and go to bed at 4 a.m. and go back to work at 7 a.m. and holding that space within me and wondering, what should I do? Should I fly back to France before they shut down the borders, or should I stay here? It is something, yeah.
Yeah, and I would notice too that during, depending on the province, but during a lot of the lockdowns, the kids were home from school and parents were having to juggle everything, trying to keep their kids doing online learning, trying to do their jobs themselves, with potentially their spouse at home as well, and not enough space for both spouses and the children to do what they need to do, not enough internet bandwidth. I mean, the regions where there is spotty internet to begin with, all of these things just contribute. And when we start working from home, especially in the beginning, I think, maybe a little bit less now, I hope, but in the beginning for sure, people are trying to prove that they're working. People are trying to prove that that they can do this, that they can be productive under these circumstances. And so people were much more, I say people, I'm speaking for myself, much more likely to want to drive myself into the ground, but to prove that I can be effective this way. And having anxiety and depression on top of that, where your confidence, your self-confidence is even lower, it's just, doubling down on trying to prove to yourself and everyone else that you can do it. And so I'm hoping that, 19 months out, people are starting to be more comfortable and confident with work from home. But I fear that, as teams change and priorities change, that's still a really big feature. And I'm hoping everybody got a bit of downtime during the RIT period, but I know some folks didn't. And, we really value that RIT period in government for that potential slowdown, so we can do a little bit more housekeeping and maybe, just relax a little bit. But some folks, it even ramps up more during the RIT. So, it's really having the confidence, like Jean-François said, having the confidence to set those boundaries is so crucial.
Thank you very much for your input, Jessica. Jean-François, I have a question for you. Quels sont les avantages de prendre nos pauses et nos vacances, c'est ça dont nous parlions, en termes de productivité, de bien-être de soi et de créativité également?
Oui, écoutez, c'est certain que c'est très important de prendre ces pauses. Et une stratégie, c'est vraiment de les insérer dans son calendrier de bureau. En insérant les pauses dans le calendrier, là, à ce moment-là, on ne reçoit pas des invitations nécessairement là, pour des réunions là, qui ont lieu pendant ces heures-là. Donc, mettre ça dans son calendrier pour l'heure du dîner, par exemple, ou autre pause. Et puis, l'autre chose aussi, c'est l'importance d'avoir de la flexibilité, si on peut discuter de ça avec notre gestionnaire. Si on sait que nous allons être, que nous avons des hauts et des bas dans notre productivité durant la journée, donc il y a peut-être moyen de maximiser là, ces périodes de haute productivité et de travailler pendant ce temps-là. Et dans les périodes de moins productives, d'insérer nos pauses à ce moment-là. C'est très important de prendre nos pauses. En fait, il y a des études qui démontrent qu'on n'atteint notre pleine productivité qu'environ 4 ou 5 heures dans une journée. Donc, c'est vraiment comment dirais-je, de s'attendre nous-mêmes, là, de pouvoir être productif pendant 8 heures consécutives n'est pas vraiment réaliste. Hein, et en fait, c'est pas naturel. Donc, prendre ses pauses, prendre ses vacances. Ça, c'est vraiment important, c'est crucial. Et peut-être même moins tentant dans les derniers 18 mois parce qu'on ne pouvait pas vraiment aller à quelque part si nous voulions prendre une vacance. Mais pour ma part, de ma propre expérience, j'ai continué à prendre mes congés pour me ressourcer, pour me recharger et je reviens plus productif et plus créatif dans mon travail après avoir pris une pause. And that's something that I kind of learned the hard way. So I went through a major mental health issue in 2012 that really was a wake-up call. Pre-2012, I was the kind of guy who, rarely took his holidays. So they would accumulate, right? And I'd get some of them cashed out because I never took my holidays. Or if I took holidays, it wasn't really to recharge, rest, or relax. It's because the honey-do list at home had gotten so big that I needed time off from work to do the stuff at home. But I mean, I've learned from that where I'll admit that I sometimes will not take my full complement of holidays, but I've learned to sort of schedule them. So, for example, in my current work, there are very clear peak periods because a lot of the work I do is around mental health promotion that are tied to national awareness campaigns. So, for example, next week is Mental Illness Awareness Week. So this is a very busy period for me. So I've got the following week booked off. So that's something that I've learned that I need for my own self-care in order to come back, more rested and recharged to take on the start of the planning for the next campaign that's coming along. So please take your paid time off, even if it's just to stay at home and do whatever re-energizes you, whether it's reading a book, going on hikes, or, whatever activities you find and derive pleasure from that, will lower the stress and whatnot, makes really for you to be a better employee when you come back because you are fully recharged and ready to take on the new challenges.
Merci pour vos commentaires, Jean-François, parce que je pense qu'il est important de nous rappeler en fait que prendre du temps pour nous-mêmes n'est en aucun cas un signe de faiblesse, mais bien au contraire, un moyen de prendre soin de nous assurer de notre productivité et aussi de nos efforts sur le long terme.
Jessica. Yeah, there's an expression in English I think that's very apt, and it's if you don't make time for your wellness, you'll be forced to make time for your illness. So I think those are wise words to live by.
Here we go. Thank you. Jessica, would you like to add something?
I would. I remember, I've been in the public service for 12 years now, but I remember as a young public servant with not a lot of vacation time. And being highly stigmatized and self-stigmatizing, I didn't want to let my managers know that I was struggling. And so I would use my vacation time for psychiatrist appointments, for doctor's appointments, for treatment days, for mental health days, and find that luxury of having, vacation time was suddenly spent. And it was largely because I was self-stigmatizing. And when I came to the conclusion that I needed to confide in my manager, I was able to free up some of those vacation days, taking my leave appropriately for sick days, for example, and family-related leave days that I was using my vacation for previously because I didn't want to let anyone know what was going on. So that's something that I found that really was a game changer for me and did free up that time to take vacation, which I so desperately needed, even more so when I was struggling so hard. So if anyone's in that situation, I know it can be daunting to disclose to your manager, but at least in my case, it was very well worth it, and I was able to actually take vacation time.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Jessica, because it's true that sometimes we are fearful of how people may react. But ultimately, we are in charge of our own health. Thank you. Now, based on what both of you shared, I will have a question. I would like to know what resources are there for members of community that may face stigma or shame, including for a more culturally sensitive approach. I will first ask you this question and then a follow-up question.
I can jump in there if I may.
Yeah.
So I'm married to a Black woman from South Africa, and in my seat of white privilege previous to meeting my partner, I just assumed that stigma was stigma, and that people with mental health issues or mental illness would face stigma, and it would be roughly the same for everyone, which is absolutely not the case. There are communities, are Black, Indigenous, persons of color communities, as well as other communities as well, different cultures that see mental health and mental illness differently from one another, and sometimes differently to the point where the stigma is really damaging to members of those communities who are struggling with mental illness. So it is different depending on your culture. And there are culturally sensitive resources. It's difficult to access mental health experts who share your culture, share your faith, or share your outlook on life. So that can be very difficult. There are resources that are specific to different communities that can be accessed. And I think some of those are going to be shared either by Jean-François or later on. But it is definitely worthwhile noting that it's not a level playing field. There certainly is, evidence of privilege even within a stigmatized community. And so I would always advise folks to reach out where they are comfortable. And it may not be going to family. It may be going to friends or to workmates because of that cultural divide. But do reach out, even if you're worried about being stigmatized, because it's so much more worth it for your health to reach out, to have the support that you need, and to kind of break those cultural barriers.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you. So basically, don't be afraid to reach out. Thank you.
And to Jessica's point as well about the difficulty in finding culturally relevant or sensitive support. I mean, first and foremost, we need to acknowledge even more broadly that we simply do not have enough mental health professionals in the country in terms of being able to meet the demand. So it certainly can be challenging to find the right fit in terms of mental health counseling or other forms of treatment that is culturally relevant to you. Now, I know there's been some work that's been done in recent years around this. So certainly as Government of Canada employees, I would encourage reaching out if you're looking for formal support, reaching out to the Employee Assistance Program. I know that in recent months and years, they've been doing a lot of work in this area in order to be able to find the right fit between an employee who's seeking help and to meet their cultural needs. We're also seeing, sort of on the community level, some new groups arising to support very specific cultural communities. I'm thinking, for example, Black Mental Health Canada, I think was launched in 2019 out of the Greater Toronto area. So it may require a bit of digging, in terms of looking for some of those resources that are available in your community. But I would also add that it's the importance of informal support as well, which can often come, through informal peer support. So maybe in your community, it is a trusted elder that you could turn to for advice and support. It might be a religious figure, whether it's a rabbi or a reverend. So do look within, sort of your community of belonging, and try to find sort of those supports there, that might be able to help you find the way forward in terms of what you're struggling with. Donc, en gros, ça serait mon conseil, c'est ne pas perdre espoir. Il faut quand même, c'est pas facile de se trouver de l'aide professionnelle là, qui vraiment répond à nos besoins culturels, voire même individuels. Donc, c'est un peu de, comme ils disent en anglais, le trial and error. That first counselor that you may meet may not be the right fit. So it's really about being persistent. And it's unfortunate, it's difficult, it's challenging, but when it comes to seeking and finding the right mental health help, often it takes multiple tries before you find something that is relevant to your experience, and that you can connect with that individual.
Thank you very much. And I would like to piggyback on what you just said, Jean-François. And I think also it is important to do our own homework and find out what do we need also, because it is a relationship, particularly when you engage in therapy, for instance. And it is important also to know yourself. Absolutely, absolutely. So, if I may add a few things about the EAP, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, many Black individuals that I know of were caught between the rock and the hard place when they needed some support, but they wanted to talk to a Black counselor so they wouldn't have to explain and educate again about the impact of microaggressions on their mental health, and explain that no, it's not in their head, this is how they feel. And people should know that it is also possible to ask to be put in contact with a Black individual as well when we contact EAP, because it is also a service that is appropriate, particularly when you need it. Thank you. So now I would like, if you don't mind, to move a little bit and look at the questions from our audience. We have great questions here, and I will start with one. Listening to people talk about not taking leave, wondering aloud how much this was individual versus culture, such as pre-COVID wasn't there, a common value that it was a sign of a hard worker to come in even if sick. So basically this individual would like to know, how can we make sure, and how can we make the distinction between the individual and the culture?
How easy is it to take sick leave when you're working from home? Quand c'est également facile de s'asseoir dans son chaise de travail que de s'asseoir dans son couchette. C'est très difficile à dire à les autres employés, les collègues, oh, je suis très malade aujourd'hui, je ne peux pas s'asseoir ici, mais pourquoi? It's so much easier when working from home to just wander into our chair, at our desk or wherever our desk happens to be. And it's not like the argument that you had when you were going into the office where, oh, I don't want to make everyone else sick. Now you don't have that argument. You're trying to prove your productivity. It's just as easy to sit here as it is to sit there. I haven't seen the stats, but I can only imagine that the amount of people taking sick leave has decreased to a certain extent during the pandemic for those reasons. And I mean, it's, yeah, the cultural aspect, yes, people are seen as super hard workers if they're coming to work even when sick. And we've got to change that, particularly when the sickness that we might be talking about might be invisible. So when, you know, when you're all stuffed up and your nose is running and your eyes are red and everyone can see it, okay, yeah, you're sick. But when you're struggling with mental illness or with chronic pain, as a lot of folks with mental illness struggle with as well, myself with migraines, you can't see that. And so and you're not worried about getting other people sick, and it's just as easy to sit in this chair as another. And for all of these reasons, it's so difficult to convince for me myself to take sick leave even when I may need it. I remember one day I was sitting in my office here where I am now, but without the lights off and the curtains drawn because I had a migraine. And I got on a call with my boss, and she said, "Oh, I can't see you, too dark." And I explained, "Oh, well, I've got a migraine in the dark." And she's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing at your desk in a dark room when you're struggling? You need to be taking that time." And so I think it's important for supervisors and managers as well to be able to recognize in their employees when their employees are saying, "Oh, I'm under the weather today, but I'm here," to actually change that culture and say, "You shouldn't be here. You need to take the time to take care of yourself." So I think that's something that's important to that aspect of managing employees. So it's not all necessarily to the employee to take care of themselves. The manager is there to help support the employee to take care of themselves. And we really do need to change that culture, kind of one manager and one employee at a time, to make sure that people take care of their health. That's why the benefits are there. That's why, you know, unions and employees have fought for them for so long. And we sometimes forget that. And I think it's really important to kind of reinstitute that culture.
Absolutely. And it speaks about presenteeism. So we'd rather call it sick, take care of ourselves, rather than showing up and be unproductive. Thank you, Jessica. Jean-François, souhaitiez-vous rajouter quelque chose?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's a question of, you know, making the sort of the distinction between individuals and the workplace culture, because the two sort of go hand in hand, right? But certainly when we're talking about culture change, the first thing we have to recognize is that it's not something that happens overnight. And I think Jessica really, you know, hit it on the head when she said it's one individual and one manager at a time where things are going to, you know, sort of progress, where we will, you know, sort of normalize not showing up at work when we are not well. I think the main thing I'd like to say around that, though, is I have seen a noticeable shift. Recognizing that it'll still take a long time before we get to that sort of ideal place. But with COVID-19, I think there really has been greater awareness around the importance of mental health, and in employees, you know, making that time for looking after themselves. Now that will, you know, change from one organization to the next in terms of acceptability or whatnot, but I think that it has been sort of a turning point where pre-COVID, you know, when we were talking about mental health in the workplace, the emphasis still was very much on individuals and the importance of self-care and looking after ourselves as employees. And it's really only in recent years that we've really started looking at the factors in the workplace that contribute to ill mental health in employees. So work has been done around that through the Center of Expertise. We're seeing progress, but you know, it's like we were talking about workload management a bit earlier, right? And that's one of those 13 factors, workload, that negatively can impact employee mental health. So what are we doing in terms of addressing the systemic issues that lead to this heavy workload in terms of not resourcing correctly or whatnot? Those are big, tough questions to address, and there's no sort of easy solution. But it's important to note that work is being done. We are progressing, but it will take time. And c'est de pas perdre de courage. C'est de savoir que le changement peut prendre du temps, mais c'est important à tous les jours que des gens comme vous et moi, que nous faisons le plaidoyer là, en faveur de la santé mentale pour vraiment pousser le mieux-être de tout le monde au sein de notre travail. Donc, c'est ce que je rajouterais par rapport à ça. C'est vraiment le fait que je vois des progrès depuis 5 ans. Et avec la pandémie, s'il y a bien eu un bénéfice, je pense, c'est de vraiment marteler l'importance de la santé mentale sur la performance des gens et sur le bien-être de nos gens.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-François, merci.
I wanted to just add something to that. I think it's important to note that the conversation around mental health in the workplace has really ramped up due to COVID-19, as Jean-François says. But the conversation around mental illness in the workplace hasn't received as much attention. It hasn't progressed as much, in my view. So things that, you know, folks for their mental health take self-care. If they take a day or a week for vacation, they'll come back refreshed and ready to go. But for people that are struggling with chronic mental illness, those conversations are much more fraught. And, you know, just some meditation in the morning or a day off isn't going to solve it. And so that's something that's worth noting as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that for a moment, sorry, I think this is a very interesting, you know, it's a bit of a segue from, I guess, you know, healthy work habits. Really, when it comes to mental illness in the workplace, where we need to do a lot more heavy lifting is looking around at what are those accommodations that can be put in place to help those individuals. So yes, on the one side, there's, you know, promoting positive mental health and things to sort of maintain good mental health. But on the flip side, and you know, it really is about, you know, employees with a mental illness diagnosed as such, and what are the supports that managers can put in place to help those employees when they are, you know, struggling during those times. So that could be an entirely separate conversation about, you know, what accommodations look like for various mental illnesses and you know, that kind of thing. No, I think that's a very good distinction to make, Jessica. Thank you.
I would like to remain on this topic because you brought very good points, both of you. So let me ask you this question. What would you recommend to someone who is afraid to not get their contract renewed because of the stigma? It is a reality also that we need to discuss. Donc, que conseilleriez-vous à une personne en fait qui est toujours contractuelle et qui n'a pas été titularisée et qui a peur justement d'être stigmatisée?
You're asking the hard questions. That is not easy. There are laws against discriminating against a person on the basis of their disability or illness, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And you're absolutely right. When you're on contract or when you're, you know, on assignments, you're trying to act above your level, perhaps. There is a real risk, and I'm not going to downplay it. There is a real risk that revealing a chronic mental illness, a chronic illness of any kind, but I think particularly mental illness, that you'll be seen as a liability. And where the change needs to happen here is more at the top. It's more with managers and directors general and so on, to make sure that that does not happen. Because right now, you know, as a person myself that is working on different contracts, it has been a feature of my fear to be able to be out and proud, as it were, at my workplace with my manager, to say that I do struggle, and yeah, that is not an easy one. We need to make sure it changes at the level of HR, at the level of management, that it simply is not tolerable in the same way that it wouldn't be tolerable that any other equity or equity seeking group can't be discriminated against.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Jessica. I mean, for a variety of reasons, you know, she and I have both been very open about our mental health challenges, but I wouldn't say that that's for everyone. So the decision to disclose is a very personal one. So it is one that you have to seriously reflect on. Part of it will really be around the relationship that you have with your manager. And that will vary from one workplace to the next, even within the same division, right? So it is maybe a little too dependent on that sort of relationship between a manager and an employee. So yeah, I mean, a word of caution around disclosure, especially if you know you are not an indeterminate employee. But even as indeterminate employees, it's not a decision to be taken lightly. So again, you know, progress has been made, but we still have a long way to go in terms of stigma reduction around mental illness. So you know, it's a cautionary tale. I think it's important to be very cautious and to really weigh the pros and cons of disclosure and how that might help you. And perhaps it's not a question of necessarily coming out and saying I have been diagnosed with X, but it could be somehow, you know, look, I'm experiencing this, and this is how it's impacting my work. So can we look at a different way of doing things? So that's an informal type of accommodation. And accommodations don't have to be, you know, necessarily. And maybe I should hesitate and say accommodation is the more formal term that yes, you know, you should have all that documented. But on the flip side, there is flexibility between, you know, how our employees work and that flexibility that managers can give and not have that sort of one size fits all approach to how you manage all the members of your team. And so, you know, hopefully you're in a good place with a good team that recognizes different working styles and that, you know, some informal small a accommodations can be made in terms of work routines or the tools used that will, you know, enhance your performance as you are dealing with a symptom of a mental illness.
Thank you very much for those useful tips. Now I would like to select another question. What are the things I should really include in my day to maintain my mental health? What do you include as part of your daily routine? Jessica, would you like to start?
Sure, I was trying to give space. I tend to jump in, so I was trying to give some space there. But for me, it is a requirement of my life that I get some exercise every day. And struggling as I have been during the COVID pandemic with my mental illness, that's sometimes taking a walk around the block or, you know, getting down on the ground and playing with my son. Sometimes it's a little more ambitious, doing, you know, a spin class or something of the sort. So, but exercise, I've got to move my body. I've got to get my heart pumping, even just a little bit, even if it's, you know, just a walk. And the other thing is diet. I had alluded to it earlier, but it's so easy to grab, you know, unhealthy snacks with the kitchen literally to my right. And it seems some days so much more difficult to grab a healthy snack. And so having to make sure that I'm fueling my body with the stuff that it needs to be well or to get well. Those two things. And I know we say them all the time, diet and exercise, but it actually, I've learned during this pandemic that they are really crucial to me. Another thing is my medications. So for me, I need to make sure I work into my workday, taking my appropriate medication, and taking the time to do those doctor's appointments, those treatment appointments, making sure I work those into my workday as well. And the final one I would say is a little bit of fun. making sure I schedule into every single day, either whether it's a coffee break with a colleague over Zoom or Teams or whatever, or whether that's a little bit of fun with my family. It can't all work and no play, right? So even when I don't feel like it, even when I'm depressed and really not enjoying anything, still working in something that's a little bit fun, a little bit potentially frivolous. And even if I'm not feeling it at that moment, it's beneficial to me and to my mental health.
A little bit of fun. I take note of that. Thank you very much. Jean-François.
Yes, again, I would just reiterate that, what works for me won't necessarily work for you. So it really is about that self-awareness and establishing that routine that will work for you. One of the things that I have found beneficial is that I have 2 school-aged children. And so I've now sort of arranged for this school year, as opposed to them taking the bus because of concerns around transmittability of COVID, et cetera. I now drive them in the morning. And so in some respects, that's kind of like my mini commute that is built into my daily routine in terms of making that transition from, the home life of being a parent and then, being the senior advisor at, on mental health at TBS. So it's a 20-minute commute as opposed to my hour plus via public transit. But that little 20 minutes of just dropping the kids off at school, usually grabbing a coffee on the way back home, is sort of that important break that sort of sets my mind and in some ways my body into workplace mode. So that is something that has been beneficial to me, and of course, regularly scheduled breaks, and if you can, sometimes, if it helps you, there's nothing that I find more challenging than if I have like 3 back-to-back meetings on Teams or Zoom. So if I see that my schedule is starting to fill up, I try to like slot in a little 15-minute break in between meetings if I can, just to break up that pace of being sort of, always on screen through this medium, so that would be sort of, what works for me.
Well, Jessica and Jean-François, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with both of you. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to sign up for the next event, The Unexpected Journey, Finding Career Satisfaction Differently. Be well. Take care of yourself.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.